Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another day of Maple Leaf Mystery. We are thrilled to have you with us. We're having so much fun here, and we hope you're enjoying it too. And today we have a very special author spotlight on Ian Rankin, interviewed by Melody Campbell. And we'd love to have your audience questions. So be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A box that we have at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to let us know how everything's going in the chat section as well. And so without further ado, I will hand things over to Melody Campbell and Ian Rankin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for being here today. It's my honor to introduce Ian Rankin and to throw some questions at him, perhaps torture him a little bit with questions. This is my hero, I'll have you know. I am a huge Rebus fan, so I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be doing this. Thank you, Ian, for being here. And we know you as the #1 best-selling author of the Inspector Rebus series. These books have been translated into 36 languages and are bestsellers worldwide. You're the recipient of 4 Crime Writers Association Dagger Awards, and you have no idea how we revere the CWA awards here in Canada. We really do. And you've won the prestigious Diamond Dagger. This is the biggest as far as we're concerned over here. Just thrilling. In 2002, you received an OBE for services to literature. Doesn't get any higher than that. You've recently, this week, won another award, the British Book Awards, the Book of the Year for Crime and Thriller, and you're going to be talking about that today. Thank you so much, Ian, for being here. I'd like you to start by showing us this coolest award. Put it up there, please, again.
It's cool.
Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? Okay, and that goes on the shelf with all your other awards, of which there are many, and there are many honorary degrees as well. You have had over 20 Rebus books, but I think today we'd like to have you read from your newest book. And shall we start with the reading, Ian? Have you got a
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Could you talk about it first a little bit and then bring us into the reading?
Well, I mean, let me just jump in, and then we can talk a little bit about how I came to write, you know, some maybe the section I'm just about to read from, amongst other things. I mean, it's The Dark Remains, it's William McIlvanney and Ian Rankin. It's something the like of which I've never done before and probably will never do again. Trying to capture another writer's voice, really. So this book is, William McIlvanney wrote a lot of books, but he wrote 3 crime novels featuring a detective called Laidlaw. And when he died a few years ago, he left behind some notes for a book he was thinking of writing, which would be a prequel. It would be an early book featuring Laidlaw. And his widow got the notes to me and asked if there was anything I thought I could do with it. You know, could it be turned into a book? And anyway, it did. And this is the start of chapter 6. So the book opens with a killing of a kind of gangland accountant. And so this is a meeting of the gang afterwards. So one funeral's already in the planning, and it's put me in the mood for another. The only thing is, this one will be a bit more private. The foundations of a motorway flyover would be ideal. You get what I'm saying. Cam Colvin looked at each face in turn across the polished oval table. He'd summoned his men to the function suite of the Corona Hotel. The manager, Dan Tomlinson, had seen them settled with tea, biscuits, and a jug of water. After he'd left, Colvin's look intimated to the others that even supposing they just stumbled from the baking heat of a parched desert, they weren't to touch anything. He wanted them focused on his words, his demeanor. Colvin was not the biggest of men, yet he filled a room without effort. His face was a locked door with a peephole through which he studied and learned. He had draped his black 3/4 length Crombie coat over the back of the chair and run a hand through his hair to push it back into place. The cut was slightly long, as though teddy boys had never gone out of fashion. Ever since his early teens, his reputation had been growing He'd run with a gang and fought with unusual ferocity, never backing down no matter the threat level. But he was savvy too and cautious in matters of business. The men gathered here were the few he genuinely trusted. To others, it might have resembled a committee of gargoyles. But in Colvin's line of work, you didn't want staff whose looks put people at ease. I'm judge and jury on this one, he went on, and sentence has already been pronounced. He ran a finger down the front of his dark tie, as if to ensure nothing was out of place. But he's alive when he gets to me, understood? It's my job to do the necessary dismantling, and that process will maybe take a while. His eyes scanned the group again. They were still paying attention. There was an empty chair to Colvin's right. Past that sat Panda Patterson, Mickey Ballater, Dodd Menzies, and Spanner Thompson. Panda's love of food would normally have had him on his third or fourth biscuit by now, but he knew to behave himself today of all days. This is a message to us. It's telling us something. Somebody out there thinks we'll leave it alone? No chance. I want you to start asking around, and don't feel you need to be subtle about it. It's fast answers I'm after, not diplomacy. See this chair here? He patted it. This is where Bobby should be sitting, and it needs to be filled. Hopefully by whichever one of you brings me the news first. He paused, letting the invitation percolate. So give me some ideas. Where would you start looking? Pub's an obvious one, Panda Patterson said, his voice like slurry. It's on John Rhodes's turf, though. No though about it, Colvin snapped. Territory's a thing of the past until this gets solved. What about Jenny? Dodd Menzies offered. Jenny's difficult, Colvin said, shifting in his seat. The wife doesn't know. Bobby was always clever that way. I'd rather Monica didn't find out. She's got enough on her plate before you factor in the kids. Besides, stabbed behind a pub. Does that sound like a crime of passion to you? No, this was business. Which brings us back to John Rhodes, Spanner Thompson piped up. He had a reedy voice, one that sometimes caused strangers to chuckle or tease him, which they did only until the heavy spanner, his implement of choice, was drawn from his inside pocket. Colvin pressed his hands together. I'll maybe be needing a word with John, but let's hold off and see if he comes to us first. Other routes we should be travelling? Bobby had no shortage of enemies, boss, Mickey Ballater offered. You know that. He was a good enough fixer, but lousy at keeping his head down. A number of times I've had complaints from clubs and restaurants he walked out of without paying. Anybody resisted, he reminded them who he worked for. There were nods around the table. Oh, I don't suppose you've ever done that, Mickey. Or you, Dodd. We're all family here, right? Don't go speaking ill of the dead. Colvin paused. Okay, the man had a bit of history, and maybe you need to dig into that. What worries me, though, is how blatant the killing was. Either someone's putting Rhodes in the frame, someone like Matt Mason, or else Rhodes himself thinks he's bulletproof. That's why I see it as a message we need to decode. Not easy for people whose only paper qualifications are for truancy, but that doesn't mean you're not going to work flat out. I want you busting your gonads on this, okay? Once the nods around the table had satisfied him, he got to his feet and produced a tray from a cupboard. It held a bottle of whiskey and 6 glasses. He poured the measures with due ceremony and handed them round, leaving one in front of the empty chair. Bobby was a valued member of our team, one who kept us a barge pole's distance from any whiff of fraud or tax evasion. So here's to absent friends. He raised his glass in a toast. They drank in silence. Patterson swallowed, wiped his mouth on his shirt cuff. Okay, have a biscuit now, boss? He asked.
Thank you, Ian. You're going to laugh. If you can see this, I had dog-eared that page, and I'd even put some ink there to remind me to ask you about this, because this is some of the best description I've ever heard. This was going to be one of the questions. Colvin was not the biggest of men, but he filled the room without effort. His face was a locked door with a peephole through which he studied and learned. Is that you, or is that McIlvaney? Or is it both?
I'm pretty sure that particular line is McIlvaney. Much of that scene is me. What Willie left behind were scraps of possible scenes and the occasional line of dialogue and the occasional bit of description. most of these characters appear in his other books.
Mhm.
And so I was able to take physical descriptions of them from those other books, and was able to, you know, having read a few scenes that Willie had written of gangsters talking to each other, I was
Yes.
able to sort of get the rhythms and get the kind of how I felt he would have written that scene.
Yeah.
So I was kind of working from a few props that he'd left behind.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you, when I first received the book, I thought, oh my God, it's not Rebus. What am I going to do? I mean, I'm a huge Rebus fan. Now I'm thanking you for introducing me to Laidlaw. Uh, I really enjoyed this book. I want to hear about how it came about that you were given the material to write this, and then I want to hear about how it felt to do it, to kind of
Okay.
fit yourself into another writer's skin.
Well, sit back and relax, and I'll tell you a story. And I'll try to keep it as crisp as possible. It all begins with me as a young man in my late teens, early 20s, wanting to be a writer, and coming across the novels of William McIlvanney, who was a literary novelist. He'd won literary prizes for his fiction, but then in 1977, 78, he writes Laidlaw. This is the kind of the cheap, tawdry paperback that I bought of it at the time. And he writes Laidlaw, and then he writes 2 more books with this detective. And he kind of made it okay for me to write crime fiction. I was at university, I was studying literature, but I saw no difference between crime fiction and literature because William McIlvanney, a literary novelist, was writing crime fiction. So I ran up to him at the Edinburgh Book Festival in 1985, at the time when I was writing the first Rebus novel. And I said, oh, Mr. McIlvanney, I'm a huge fan. I'm writing a book that's a little bit like yours, but set in Edinburgh. And the book I had with me was Docherty, which was a book of his that had won a literary prize. It had won the Whitbread Prize for Fiction in 1975. And so on the inside of it, he wrote, for Ian, good luck with the Edinburgh Laidlaw.
Oh my.
Best wishes, Willie McIlvanney. I don't know if you can read that.
Yep. Yes, we can. Oh, wow.
And I think he probably thought, I'll never see this guy again. He probably meets hundreds of writers, or people who say they're going to be writers, or people who tell him they are writers, and he probably never sees them again, and they never publish anything. But you know, the years passed. I published quite a few books, and then we started working together. We did events together, and he said to me, Ian, the Edinburgh Laidlaw did well.
Mm-hmm.
His books have been out of print for years, though. A lot of these, all the Laidlaw books had been out of print, and an Edinburgh publisher called Canongate got wind of that a few years ago, and they did a deal. They said, we want to bring these books back into print. And they got all the great Scottish crime writers of the day to say nice things about Willie and about the books. And so they were republished. And he had this lovely third act in his life, where suddenly he was going to festivals and getting audiences of 700 and 800 people. I interviewed him in Harrogate at the biggest crime festival in the UK. And he was sitting backstage going, who the hell's going to come to this to see me? You know, we're in the middle of Yorkshire in England. They don't know me. I've been out of print for years. We walked into a hall of 800 people, standing room only, and I could see him elevate. He just rose from the floor because he was just so pleasantly surprised and overjoyed to see the reaction to his books. And then he died. And it was a huge loss to literature. And a few years passed, and his widow got in touch with Canongate and said, look, I found all these handwritten notes. Because Willie had had this late period success, I think that had given him the idea that he'd written off Laidlaw, the character, too cheaply. And he could maybe bring him back. And he got an idea for at least 2 books, judging from the notes I was given, one a prequel, an early case, and one the final case, set during Laidlaw's last week as a police detective. There wasn't much of that book, that second book, but the prequel, there was quite a lot of notes, over 100 pages of notes, which had been typed up. And so so my first job when I was presented with this during lockdown in 2020, I was presented this by Canongate. My first job was an archaeologist, because basically I was just digging to see what was there and how did this bit connect to that bit, and maybe could I do this and could you do that, from all these little disparate scenes and character sketches that he'd written. And then I went back and reread the books, tried to get the rhythms of his narrative voice. And then the book was set in 1972 Glasgow. I didn't know Glasgow in 1972. I was 12 years old, and living the other side of the country. But lockdown eased a little bit, and I was able to go to the National Library of Scotland here in Edinburgh and get the Glasgow newspapers for 1972. And it was this lovely, bizarre coincidence that in October 1972, one of the stories I came across was a young writer being taken on as writer in residence by the University of Glasgow, and it was William McIlvanney. There he was, staring out of the newspaper at me. And I didn't know if it was going to be any good or not. I mean, I said to Canongate, the publisher, I said, look, I must have the freedom to walk away at any point if I don't think I'm doing a good enough job, because it needs to be good. I need to respect McIlvanney the man and McIlvanney the legacy. And when it was finished, it was sent to his widow, and she wrote me a lovely handwritten letter. Don't get many handwritten letters these days. She said, Ian, you gave him back to me.
Oh.
The weekend that I sat in the living room and read that book, it was as though Willie was sitting next to me.
Oh, that's
I thought, well, job done. I don't care if everybody else hates it, but job done. She liked it. She thought I'd done a good job.
Oh, that's fabulous. Now, tell me what it was like to write it.
Well, you know, I mean, in some ways it was tough because having sifted through all the notes, there wasn't a huge amount there for me to use. There was a trail of breadcrumbs that would take me from the murder to the solution. He hadn't actually written the ending, but there were enough clues there that I thought I worked out who he thought did it and why they did it, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a little trail of breadcrumbs, and he'd written some nice descriptive passages about Glasgow and some nice descriptive passages about Laidlaw and his marriage and everything else. I thought, okay, I can use that. And yeah, so I just started, and the first page, I think a lot of the first page is yeah, a lot of the first page is Willie. He'd written the first few pages pretty much intact, and then after that it really is a patchwork.
Yes.
So he'll say, okay, we're in the pub, it's a retirement drinks party, and Laidlaw is meeting his colleagues for the first time really in this new police station. And I just did the dialogue for it. I just thought, okay, what would he do? How would he be? How would he feel? And going back to the original books and sort of thinking of the kind of guy that Laidlaw is. Now, the problem I had, several fold. Number one, I don't know Glasgow that well. Number two, I was 12 years old in 1972. Number three, Willie's writing style is much more poetical than my writing style. A bit flowerier, a bit more flowery, a bit more poetical. And his character, Laidlaw, is not like Rebus. He's a philosopher. He reads books of heavy philosophy. And he sees himself as a philosopher of the streets. And so I had to make sure that I was always writing Laidlaw and not writing a version of Rebus. Yeah, that was kind of tough. And I guess the period setting helped. I knew it couldn't be Rebus because this is 1972. And in 1972, Rebus was not yet a cop.
That part was fascinating to me. I have a book series. Some of the readers here know I write about a mob goddaughter. So I was fascinated to see you write about Glasgow and the gangs in 72. I had no idea there was so much activity.
Oh yeah. But you know, this is something, Melanie, I don't know if you felt it when you read it. If I'd been writing this book from scratch, I would not have had 3 gangsters in it. That's too many. You know, 3 different crime gangs is too many. 1, yes. 2, maybe, because then you get tension between them. 3, 1 seemed to me a little bit extraneous. But Willie had written this guy in, and in the previous books, he'd also used all 3 gangsters. So I thought, okay, if Willie wanted it, I'll do my best to make all 3 of them work in the story, even though one of them doesn't get a huge amount to do. But yeah, Glasgow was a big crime-ridden city, had a lot of poverty, a lot of money lending, a lot of gang culture with the 2 soccer teams, Celtic and Glasgow, leading to a lot of kind of violence on a Saturday. And razor gangs had been a thing. And I mean, eventually I got to know some of these guys because some of them went on to become artists and writers when they had served their long jail sentences. They came out quite artistic, creative people. And I met a few of them in the course of my writing career, which was interesting. But you know, I knew these guys weren't poets. These guys I was going to be writing about were ruthless thugs, except for John Rhodes. John Rhodes, who I mentioned in that extract, I think Willie was in love with a little bit.
Yes.
because he goes much easier on John Rhodes than the other characters.
Yeah.
As I think I do or did for a while in my books with my guy Cafferty, my gangster Cafferty owes a lot to John Rhodes, I think.
Yeah, I caught that. I want to just reassure everybody here that you read a very tense mob scene there. And there's a lot of tension in this book. But I want to assure everybody that this is also a mystery, and it's an excellent mystery. I'm going to use the words of Mickey Spillane here. No one reads a book to get to the middle. They read it to get to the end. The first page sells this book. The last page sells the next book. And you certainly sold me on the next book. This is a complex book. I found it had the perfect ending for me. It did what I like most, is I got that high from figuring out who the killer was at exactly the same point Laidlaw did. You put a clue in there and I went, I see what he's done. And it reminded me of what Agatha Christie said about Smoke and Mirrors. She said, you have to look at it, take away the smoke and mirrors and what actually happens. And then who's to gain from that? And I think you did a perfect job there. And it's an extremely complex, complicated relationships going on in there. But in the end, my goodness, it was perfectly done. And I wanted to ask you, was that your ending? But I think you hinted to the fact that he left you some breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
But I think that sounded like you, Ian.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ending is me. I mean, the epilogue, weirdly, chapter 40, he had written complete. He had the epilogue written. He had not written the climax of the book. And so I had to sort of think, well, how are we going to do this? How would Laidlaw do this? And I, although Willie hadn't spelt it out in his notes as to who the killer was and why they'd done it, because he knew, he didn't need to write it down. He didn't need to write it down for himself. He knew in his head. These notes were never meant to be read by anybody except him. So I was trying to figure out, okay, I think this is where you want this book to go, and I think this is how you thought it would get there. Maybe I got it right, and maybe I got it wrong. I will never know. We'll never know unless we find more notes tucked away somewhere. One nice thing, and you just referenced it a little bit. You referenced Agatha Christie and Mickey Spillane, short books. This kind of harks back to the days when crime novels were nice and short.
Yes.
It's barely, it's on the page here, it's about 250, 260, but in fact, it's not a long book. It's about half the length of one of my Rebus novels. And I like that. I like that concision. I like the fact there's no fat on it. And yeah, it could probably been done as if I'd stuck more rigorously to his notes and not added stuff, it would have been a novella or a long short story. But there was enough about the characters that intrigued me and more I wanted to do with them. So I kind of pencil sketch that he had left me of, say, the victim's family or the victim's widow. I then thought, well, I want to know more about you. So I'm going to write some scenes where we get to know more about you.
Yes.
And the same with the, he'd written a lovely scene after Laidlaw's colleague and his wife have been to the Laidlaw's house for dinner.
Yes.
But he hadn't really done any of the leading up to it, and he hadn't written about the dinner party itself. So I was able to add some little bits in there, which gave us more of a sense of their relationships. Also, I was asked to do that by the publisher. The publisher, when I produced the original version, said two things. It said, it just seems to be a lot of hard men sitting in smoky pubs, psyching each other out. And I said, that is kind of what happens in a McIlvanney book. If you go back and look at the original source material, that's what happens. They said, and added to that, there's not many women characters here. And I said, again, go back to the source material. There's very few women play any role at all in the early Laidlaw novels. But they asked me if I could think about adding to both of those. And so my gangsters emerge from the pub and they go walking or driving through the city, and we get a sense of the Glasgow they're driving through or walking through. The police officers' wives, we get a little bit more of their inner life, their interior life, and their relationship. And the same goes for the widow of the victim, etc., etc. And that was all stuff that I added to the, to the final draft of the book.
And
It
I'm glad you
wasn't in
did.
any of the notes.
I'm glad you did. I really felt for the widow. I was widowed 3.5 years ago, and I could really relate to her. And I miss Siobhan. I will tell you that. I miss
Oh,
Siobhan
she's coming back. She's coming
in the
back.
Rebus books.
She's coming back. She's coming back. Where have I got it? I've got it. Have I got it here? Yeah, here it is.
Yep, I've got.
There it is. So that, you know, she's in here.
Okay, good.
She's in here. And this next Rebus novel is a big fat book. It wasn't going to be a big fat book, but it turned out to be a big fat book. So you're going to get a lot of Siobhan.
I'm delighted because she's my second favorite character that you do.
Yeah. I like her a lot. I like her a lot. And I kind of feel that since Rebus retired, she's blossomed because she's no longer in his shadow. You know, Rebus is a character. When he enters a room, he just sucks all the oxygen out for other characters.
Yes.
They disappear. The reader's not interested in them anymore. They just want to read about him or Cafferty, him versus Cafferty.
Yeah.
And so,
but I love the complexity of it. I love the complexity
now that
of the
Rebus is
relationship.
retired, and she, you know, she's the cop, and
Yeah.
he's finding it harder and harder to inveigle his way into a crime investigation because he's a civilian who's, you know, knocking on for 70 years old now.
Mhm.
And he's got health problems and everything else. So so she's got a position of power over him in that there are doors she can unlock for him that he cannot unlock without her help. And I like that. I just like the way that the balance of power in our relationship has changed quite a lot.
Well, it is a very interesting relationship. I mean, she's walking his dog. I mean, while she's still working, like it. I like that. I like the complexity of it.
I wish I'd never introduced that dog, by the way.
The damn dog, eh?
Oh
we
my
all
God.
talk about the damn dog when,
Oh my
when we're
God.
writing. You introduce a dog and then you can't leave it for 12 hours.
No, and you know, I get used to it now. When my wife is my first reader, so when the novel is finished to my satisfaction, I print it off and I give it to her, and she goes through it with a marker pen. And written in the margin will be, why doesn't Rebus take the dog with him so he can take the dog for a walk after he's finished interviewing this suspect? Why has Rebus not gone home to feed the dog yet? The dog's been on its own. I'm like, oh, I wish I'd never given him a dog. I only gave him a dog because I wrote a book called Even Dogs in the Wild.
Yes.
And I thought, oh, it'd be quite fun if there's a dog in the book. And I wasn't intending a dog to stick around. And it was in that one book. And then I started writing the next book. And my wife said, oh, how's the dog getting on? I went, oh, I forgot I'd given him a dog. I have to bring the dog back in.
And I'm one of those annoying readers. Yes, I am one of those annoying readers that will notice that.
Oh yeah. And so is my
Can I
wife.
do something fun now? I want to do something fun here. You know, we have a mutual friend in Linwood Barkley, and I interviewed Linwood last week for an event we were at, and I knew the two of you were friends, and so I asked him if there's any evil question I should ask you. And we've done this in reverse. I know you gave me an evil question. And by the way, Linwood tells me you are never going to play with his trains when you come to Toronto next.
Like I'd want to. I'm not 11 years old.
Oh dear. Okay. So he said yes. Ask him about the time the police considered him a suspect.
Oh well, that was a long time ago. I was writing the first Rebus novel. I was still a student. I looked like a tramp. It was the middle of winter. I had no idea how the police operated, so I wrote to the chief of police in Edinburgh and said, "Help! Can you help me with answer some questions?" And I got a nice letter back saying, "Go to this police station, talk to these two detectives. They'll be waiting for you at 2 o'clock on Tuesday." And so I duly arrived looking like a tramp. I think I'd been up all night writing an essay, and it was the middle of winter. I was wearing these kind of secondhand clothes, kind of old overcoat from World War II or whatever. And these two very dapper detectives said, you're writing a book? I went, yeah, I'm writing a book. I've got a notebook and a pen. Just want to ask you a few questions, guys. And they said, well, what's the book about? And I said, well, there's been some child abductions in Edinburgh, and this cop is having to work on it, and he's got a mysterious past. And he went, oh, okay. And they had a little chat, and then they said, why don't we just, let's role play. Let's pretend that you're a suspect in a police investigation. and we would ask a few questions. I went, oh, great, that sounds good. And they started putting my details into the computer, but a very early computer there. And what I didn't know was that there had been an abduction outside Edinburgh a few weeks before, a child abduction, and these cops were working the case.
Oh my
So
goodness.
this crazy man walks in with this spurious story that he's writing a book. So I went into the system as a suspect, and it wasn't until I went home that weekend and told my dad, and he said, "Do you not listen to the news? Do you not read the news?" And so I checked, and they said, "Yeah, well, we've checked you out, and it's okay. We don't suspect you any longer." But I was in the system for a while as one of the few suspects they had, and it became a murder inquiry with 7 victims, I think. A guy called Robert Black. They caught him eventually. And that was a weird one as well, because I don't know how much of this is true, but I think a lot of it is true. Someone was mowing their lawn with a really old-fashioned push mower in their backyard, their back garden, and they heard a noise, and they sort of went out and they saw this van driving away, and they got the number plate, the license plate. So they phoned the police, and the police stopped the van and said, "Look, we've just had a report that something strange going on." They looked in the back of the van, and there was the next victim, still alive, rolled up in a carpet or something. And the cop who stopped the van, it was his daughter in the back of the van.
Oh
now,
my goodness.
Yeah. Now, Melanie, we could not put that in a book.
No.
If you put that in a book, that's a coincidence too far.
Yeah.
That's just a succession of coincidences that led to this guy, Robert Black, being prosecuted for 7 murders. But it's an extraordinary story, and people have, various people who were involved in it say, yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true.
Wow. Well, I've never been suspected for anything, but I was pulled over for speeding, and I got all excited and say, "Oh, can I get in your car and see what it's like?" We do our research whenever we can, don't we?
Yeah, and they thought, here's another crazy woman.
I've got another question for you. And again, Linwood and I were on a panel. We were both asked this, and I wonder if your answer would be the same. Does it get harder or easier with each successive book?
I think it gets harder, and I'm really disappointed by that. I mean, I thought it would be like, working on a car engine. And once you've worked on a car engine enough times, you can do it blindfold. But writing books just seems to get harder and harder. And partly I think it's because we are our own fiercest critics. We want each book to be better than the book before. And when you've written a certain number of books, that gets pretty hard. And we don't want to repeat ourselves. We want to keep it fresh, and we want to keep challenging ourselves. And we're also very aware, I think, of all these young whippersnappers who are nibbling at our ankles, if not our knees, as they climb up the greasy pole to get the sales that we've got and the readers that we've got. So you're always trying to make each book better and different, but not so different that it will put people off buying it, obviously. So it's a real balancing act. And I think on my side, I think in my favor is the fact that I decided that Rebus would live more or less in real time. Yeah. So when I start thinking about a new Rebus novel, he has changed. It's almost like I'm dealing with a new character because his career has moved on, his personal life has moved on, his health has moved on. Yes. And so that keeps me on my toes. I cannot get blasé about this guy. His life has moved on since the last time we met. And so that keeps him interesting to me and maybe keeps me interesting to him, and partly explains why he stuck around for as long as he has. Now, the bad news with that is, of course, inbuilt decrepitude. At some point, he's got to go. I just haven't quite reached that point yet. But many times I've said this might be the last book, thinking it maybe is the last book. But then I get an idea for something else that he can do in retirement or something else he might be interested in, or a way to bring him into a story or a plot that I've got. And he sticks around partly because he's just for me, he's the perfect way of exploring the world, of asking the questions I want to find answers to about Scotland, Edinburgh, big moral questions of good and evil, why we human beings continue to do terrible things, specifically to each other, He allows me to keep asking these questions, keep chipping away at them. And because he has been a cop, of course, he's got a lot more access to every stratum of society. The only other comparable character would be a journalist, I think, who could get you from the highest in the land to the lowest in the land. You can be talking to the Prime Minister or the First Minister of Scotland 1 minute and a drug addict or a prostitute the next. One character allows you to do that and show the interconnectedness of society. So he's been a good character for me, and I would be very reluctant to let him go, but I know that at some point I do have to let him go, or else he has to let me go.
Well, I don't know. I mean, look at Christopher Fowler with his Bryant and May series. I mean, you know, Bryant's way into his 80s at this point, and they're still great books. They're funny as hell.
Yeah.
So I, you know, keep Rebus going.
But the one thing, right? Because people always said to me, "Oh, you can go back in time and write early Rebus," and I went, "No, those would be historical novels. That would be a lot of work. I'm not interested in that." Having done The Dark Remains,
yes,
I suddenly thought this is actually quite fun. And one of the most fun things about it is you don't have to factor in the modern world. I mean, these days, somebody's getting kidnapped. Let's just track their mobile phone. There they are. Yes. Let's go and get them. You know, they're there on CCTV. Let's look at their computer. Let's, you know, all this stuff. 1972, none of that. No computers, no CCTV, no DNA analysis in the lab. The kind of autopsy was a much more basic thing than it is now. Crime scene analysis was much more basic than it is now. All of that. So the cops had to work by instinct and a network of informers. They had to prowl the street. They got to know the streets. And I liked that. I liked the simplicity of that. So I would like now to maybe take Rebus back. Now, it wouldn't be the 70s, it would be the early 80s. Just before the first novel. The first novel was set about 85, 86. Yeah. So it would be just before that. But I think I might give it a go one of these days.
I'd be a big fan of that. Please do it. And I know what you mean about the cell phones. I noticed that going to pay phones in this book, and the informants was very interesting, how important informants were at the time. That was great. You've touched on something that I had a question about here. On page 71 of the hardcover of The Dark Remains, Laidlaw says, "The law is not about justice. It's a system we put in place because we can't have justice." I heard Rebus there.
Yeah, but I think that's Willie, actually. I think that was a line that Willie wrote. Yeah, but I mean, again, he does share that. He shares that sense that the criminal justice system, as we all know, is a very imprecise and blunt instrument and doesn't always get the results you would like. And that's very frustrating for someone like Rebus or someone like Laidlaw, who really want to put the bad people away and make sure they don't do any more bad things. And yeah, it's an interesting one. You've got kind of natural justice and you've got man-made justice, human-made justice, and they're very difficult beasts, and they don't always work together and balance very well. And Rebus, you know, Rebus would always, to get a result, he will just push things a little bit and push things a little bit, and he will cross the line in a way that I think Laidlaw would also cross the line, but then jump back. He's never going to go to the dark side and stay there, but he will manipulate people, or he might not manufacture evidence, but in the past he might have done back in his early days to put away someone he knows is guilty of something, even if he has to get them for something else.
Yes. I like that. I like in crime books, in my own and definitely in yours, I like the exploration of the gray. The gray part. Everything's not black and white. It's gray. And I think you do that so beautifully.
Yeah, and I think we're always kind of fighting in a sense, because of course crime readers, many of them come to the genre because they like it cut and dried. They like at the end all their questions have been answered. The order has been restored, as in a Shakespearean comedy, that bad people have been punished or are about to be punished, and things will go back to normal again because of this witty and charismatic investigator who has pointed the finger and said, "You did it." But real life ain't like that. And I think a lot of us as crime writers want to explore the fact that real life is quite messy, and you don't always get a really cut and dried solution or a clear solution to these things. And it's trying to satisfy both, trying to satisfy my thinking as a writer, that I want to keep things a little bit messy, but also satisfy the reader that the detective has played a role in clearing up this problem, or solving this puzzle.
Mhm. Alex is going to call on us soon. I just have one last question, which I know people have asked me, is we know that Linwood does his downtime with model trains. What do you do when you're not reading and writing?
I do crosswords, I do jigsaws, I listen to a lot of music, I go to gigs, I go to the pub a lot, but I do call that research. So that's, I mean, I get a lot of great ideas in pubs, and people tell me stories and give me ideas and all sorts. I go walking around Edinburgh a lot. It's a great city to walk around and just kind of enjoy the city and learn a little bit more about it. I read a lot of books. I've got piles and piles and piles of unread books. Yeah, all of that, everything pretty much except model trains.
Oh, thank you. You've talked a bit about, just a little bit about the next rebus coming out. Is that coming out in November? Is that
it's coming out in the UK and Canada, and I think also in the United States. It's coming out at the same time. I think it's all coming out early October. But I'm hoping to do a Canadian tour early November, pretty much the first week in November. I don't yet know the itinerary, but when I do know the itinerary, it will be up on my website, and it will be on Twitter, so that everybody
Excellent.
gets a chance. But it won't be as many cities as I would normally do, because we're still coming out of COVID. Things are still very uncertain. But I'll try and maybe get, I don't know, 4 or 5 cities minimum.
Wonderful. We'll keep track of that. Okay, Alex, I know that we have questions from the audience. I've seen some things going up. Do you want to moderate for that, please?
Absolutely. So we'll get right in started here. So we have a message from Wendy. She wants to know, how many books do you think about writing at any given time? Just the one you're currently writing, or do you think about 2 or 3?
No, I'm a very lazy writer in some ways. I get one good idea a year if I'm lucky. I get one idea. That's all I need though, because that'll give me one book. And I'm slowing down. I used to write 2 books a year, then I went to a book a year, and now I've gone to a book every 2 years. COVID was different. During COVID, I wrote a lot because there was nothing else to do. So I've got in my head now, I've just finished this Rebus novel, comes out in October. I've got nothing. I've got no ideas, no plans, no nothing. My next book has to be delivered in May 2024. So I might take 2023 off. My wife says if I don't take 2023 off, we're getting divorced. So she plans for us to do a lot of traveling, which is great, because when I travel, I do get ideas.
That's fabulous. All right. So from one of our guests, according to Wikipedia, your parents were horrified when they found out you chose to be a writer as opposed to following a trade. Were they less horrified when you became a successful writer?
It's a sad story in a way. Yeah, I mean, I grew up working class, blue collar. Parents didn't live, they didn't own their own home. It was a rented house. They both worked in kind of manual jobs. Mum worked in a canteen, dad worked in a dockyard. I was the clever one in the family, the first one to go to college, go to uni, and they, at age 17, I was supposed to go and do accountancy because I had an uncle who lived in England, and he owned his own house and he owned his own car. So they thought, well, this is a trade Ian can get that will mean he can look after us in our old age. So I was going, and then I had this epiphany, age 17. I thought, why am I going to college to study a subject I've got no interest in just so I can get a job? I'm going to study literature. I love books. I'm just going to, so I had to tell my parents that, and they said, what kind of job are you going to get when you come out of college having studied literature? I went, I'll become a teacher. I mean, that's what I thought I was going to do. Anyway, I went off and I studied literature and I started writing. Now, my mum died when I was 19, so she died when I was just starting 2nd year at university. So she never saw me be a published writer at all. My dad died when I was 29, so by that stage I'd had 3 or 4 books published, but not really successfully. But he was around to see me be published, but not not have any success. My sister, God bless her, Linda, is still with me. Another sister died, but Linda's still here. So she's the one. She's my older sister. So she's the one I send the books to when they're published, and she's the one who gets to celebrate my success with me. Yeah, I do wish my parents had been around to see at least some of it.
Oh, that's very tough. I'm so glad you have your sister. Is she close to you? Does she live in Edinburgh as well?
She lives in Perth, which is about an hour's drive from Edinburgh. You know, she's in her 70s. No, she's not. Shit, she'll kill me for saying that. She's 70 next year. She's in her mid 60s. Yes. And so she was shielding a little bit during COVID, so we didn't see each other. We've only seen each other a couple of times in the last year or so, but we phone each other up all the time, and we keep in touch.
Okay. This is recorded.
I can't believe it.
She wants to see it later.
She's not watching this. If she's watching this, I'm getting a bullet to the head.
We're going to go to the next question from Tony. What's your writing process like? Are you obsessive outlining or carefree?
Well, the McIlvanney book was already, it was done for me. It was already outlined, so that was fine. Normally, I don't outline very much. There are two types of planners and pantsers, and I tend to be a pantser. I fly by the seat of my pants. So I'll start with a kind of theme I want to explore. I'll find a plot, a murder that allows me to explore that theme, and then I just start. And if you're doing a murder story that starts with a murder, it writes itself for the first 40 or 50 pages if you're writing about cops. You'll have the crime scene analysis, who's the victim, who are the relatives, who do they work with, what enemies do they have, can we check CCTV, check their phone, check their computer, blah, 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 blah. So the first 40 or 50 pages pretty much write themselves. What you hope is by that point, you've gone off in some interesting tangents that will lead you further into the book. I've usually got a vague idea where I think the book is going, but it doesn't necessarily go there. It sometimes goes off in a complete tangent and never comes back again. And I just follow it. I go, okay, book, you know where you're going. I will just follow you. Now that terrifies some people. Some writers go, that's horrifying. I can't believe you do that. But I found that the book always knows where it wants to go. There's a deep structure to the book that I cannot see while I'm writing that first draft. I just trust that the book will get me there. And who was it? It was E.L. Doctorow, that famous E.L. Doctorow quote. He said, writing a book is like driving a car on a foggy night. You can only see a few yards past the headlamps, but if you keep going, you'll get to your destination. And I trust to that. It works for me, but it wouldn't necessarily work for anybody else.
Very wise and interesting, that one. This is a message from Dawn. Ian, I love the Rebus series and the Harvey books too, but my question is about something else. How did you get involved in writing John Constantine in Dark Entries?
Oh, wow. That was a long time ago as well. This was a comic book, graphic novel. The first things I ever read when I was a kid were comics. We didn't have many books in the house. My parents weren't really readers, but I was indulged. I was allowed to buy 5 or 6 or 7 comics a week. They were cheap, affordable literacy. And I tried drawing my own comics because I was an obsessive kid. It wasn't enough to read them, I wanted to write them as well. But I was no good at drawing. I had little stick figures, and so I decided I would write instead. And then, fast forward 30 odd years, and suddenly DC Comics in New York get in touch and they say, oh, we believe from various interviews you've done that you're a big fan of comic books. Have you ever thought about scripting one? And so we just bounced around ideas, and the idea that they liked a lot was for a standalone John Constantine. Now, he's a character who is a kind of supernatural private detective. So he's a private detective who works on cases involving the supernatural. So there's a touch of Chandler about him, but there's also a bit of horror fiction in there and a bit of supernatural in there. So it was great fun to do. And I had a lot of fun doing it. I never, ever met the artist. The artist, I think, was living in Italy. The editor was in New York. I was in Edinburgh, I think, when I wrote it. And I've never met the artist, but it was good fun. But after I did that one, I pitched a few other ideas. They didn't seem so interested, and eventually I went back to the day job, having fulfilled my childhood dream.
So here's a question from Leslie. I was surprised when I found Rebus and Fox in the same books. Not many authors do that. Can you talk a little bit about why you put these two together? What challenges did you face in doing this?
Kind of weird, isn't it? Because if those who know my books and also know Michael Connolly's books know that Michael Connolly has done this. That he had two series running parallel, and then he found a way to bring the two main characters together. It just seemed, okay, what happened was Rebus retired. He'd hit 60. In 60 in Scotland, you have to retire as a detective. I wanted to still write about cops. And I didn't want to anybody, if I was going to write about cops, I didn't want to write about Rebus 2.0. And I'd been talking to someone who had worked in complaints, internal affairs. I thought that's fascinating because that's a very different kind of character from Rebus. They've got to be law abiding and not cross the line and everything else. And everybody hates them. All the other cops hate them because they're investigating bent cops. So that was where Malcolm Fox came from. And then I found a way to bring Rebus back, working cold cases as a civilian. There was a real unit in Edinburgh, still is, that was staffed by 3 or 4 retired detectives and would look at old unsolved cases. And I thought, this is perfect for Rebus. He wouldn't want to go gentle into that good night. He would want to be working as a cop if he possibly can, even if he's retired and doing it. I thought, well, there's one guy I can think of who wouldn't want a bent cop or a maverick cop like Rebus on the force, and that's Malcolm Fox. So I found a way to bring Fox in as an antagonist. Having been a protagonist, suddenly he's the antagonist. And I enjoyed that. And then Fox just, what happens? People just stick around. Cafferty, the gangster who runs Edinburgh, was meant to be in one book and one book only. He was a cameo role, a minor character in book 3. And then he wasn't in book 4, 5, 6, I think. And then I just thought, hey, he was an interesting guy. Maybe I should bring him back. There's more I can do with him and Rebus. They can knock heads together. So he just stuck around, and Malcolm Fox just keeps sticking around. And I don't know, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Do we like him? Do we hate him? He's a complex character. His relationship with Rebus is complex. His relationship with Siobhan Clarke is complex. I like him a lot. I don't like him. I just find him a really interesting character.
So here's a message from Wendy. Any ideas as to the character who will appear after Rebus, or have you gone there yet? So it's a bit to what you were just talking about.
Yeah. You know what? I mean, I've been in this game. I mean, I've been a published author since I was 25. I'm now 62. My wife is saying to me, it's time to take your foot off the gas. Write a book if you get a great idea and if you feel like writing a book, but don't feel you've got to write a book just because you've got a contract waiting for you, you've got an audience waiting for you. So I think she's thinking of semi-retirement. She's thinking that we should be easing into at least semi-retirement. So no, I don't know what I would do next. I've written a couple of stage plays and I've enjoyed the process of writing stage plays. There is a Rebus stage play that I wrote during lockdown that's looking for it's got a producer, but he's casting it just now and looking for theatres where it might play. And that's quite fun, right? Something that just challenges me and makes me think, like doing a comic book, doing a graphic novel made me think about narrative in a different way. Writing a stage play made me think about narrative in a different way. So I don't know, maybe I'll do the Rebus cookbook, These seem to be very popular in the best, mindfulness with John Rebus, maybe I'll do one of those. Yeah.
That's great. We just have a few minutes left, so we'll see what we can get through here. This is from Magnus. Do you have any plans for books or characters outside of Rebus? So again, you just touched on that a little bit. So maybe a cookbook.
maybe a cookbook. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Siobhan is there. Siobhan's in my back pocket. Yes. She's young enough. She could keep a series going on her own if I really felt the need to keep writing cop novels set in Edinburgh. So the end of Rebus wouldn't necessarily mean the end of me as a crime writer. But who knows? I don't know. I mean, the first thing is the good Lord has to spare me. And right now, as a famous Canadian singer once sang, I ache in the places where I used to play. I'm getting old. I'm getting creaky and I'm getting old. And who knows how many more stories I've got left in me.
All right, do we have time? Yeah, we need a little more time here. So from Jane, a supposed rule of writing is not to kill a child or an animal in your books. Have you done that and survived readers' anger? And what other rules of writing could be broken?
Nice, I like that. Yeah, I mean, the first book is about a series of child murders,
Yes.
which is not a great starting point. And then quite an early Rebus novel had him accidentally kill a cat. He was dating a doctor, and the cat was annoying him, so he locked the cat flap with the cat outside, and the cat was attacked and eaten by a fox. And oh my God, the complaints I got from readers about the dead, and the dead kids, not so much. Dead cat, huge complaints.
Oh, no.
So yeah, never work with children and animals. I don't know. You know what? There shouldn't be any rules. There just shouldn't be any rules. I think you do what you need to do. You do what's necessary for the story. But of course, we all have inbuilt blockers. We all have lines that we're not going to cross. So I'll give you another example. I wrote a book called Dead Souls, and Dead Souls had a paedophile who's been released from jail, and Rebus outs the guy, and the guy is murdered, and then Rebus feels bad about it, and has to investigate his murder. It was based on a true case, and originally when I started writing it, I was writing the sections with the paedophile in the first person, and I started and I thought, I don't want to be here. I do not want to be inside this guy's head. And so I wrote them in third person to get some distance between me and him, which is maybe a little bit of cowardice. Around about the same time, I was also making a TV documentary series on evil. And my producer, without my knowledge, had contacted a very famous serial killer in the UK, Ian Brady. No, he hadn't. He'd contacted Ian Brady's mother and said, can we interview you about what it's like to be the mother of a serial killer? She sent that message to Ian Brady himself in a secure psychiatric hospital where he was being held. He got back to the producer and said, no, Mr. Rankin doesn't talk to my mom. Mr. Rankin talks to me. And I refused. I said, there's no way I'm letting that guy inside my head, because once he's inside my head, he ain't coming out. He loved to play psychological games with people. He'd written a non-fiction book, which I'd read, and I thought it was horrible, and I would gladly see it burned. I think it's the only book I've ever read that I would gladly see burned, which was basically a paean of praise to the serial killer. It's a higher life form. So I refused. And again, that was maybe an act of cowardice. Maybe I should have gone along and met him, or talked to him at least, or communicated with him. So I couldn't do it. So we've all got boundaries. We've all got boundaries. And we decide what those boundaries are as writers.
Thank you so much for answering these questions. We have several more, but our time is coming to an end here. I just want to thank you on behalf of Maple Leaf Mystery and all of our wonderful guests here who've tuned in today. Thank you so much for making the time to come out to our debut conference. This has been fantastic. Thank you, Melody, for your wonderful interview. Ian, we hope to see you again. We're really excited for your next books coming out, and don't stop. I mean, tell your wife no. Canada says no. You're not allowed to retire yet.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, Melody knows as much as I do. The writers never really retire, do they? They always die. They always die at the desk with a book unwritten.
Yes, true.
With the perfect novel unwritten.
Yes. And Ian, it's been a true pleasure for me. Thank you for the hours of pleasure you've given me as a reader and all of us out there. Please continue.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Hopefully I'll see some of you physically in Canada when I tour in November. Fingers crossed I don't get COVID and the world doesn't lock down again, and we're able to sort of meet and celebrate books in person. As wonderful as Zoom is, it's not quite the same thing. There are stories I can't tell you now that I can tell you in person, so stick around.
In the pub. In the pub.
With a beer.
Yes.
Cheers. Cheers.